Hello everyone and welcome back to The Red Path. My name is Dara and you're tuning into Competitive Insights. Today we're continuing our deep dives into the detachments in the World Leaders Codex, and it's time for the Cult of Blood. I'll be breaking down key abilities, unit synergies, meta archetypes and example lists so that you'll have all the tools you need for starting your own blood-hungry, brass-worshipping cult of maniacs. This detachment is honestly absolutely crazy, so let's not waste any more time and jump straight into it. To kick things off, I'm going to run through an overview of the detachment. The Cult of Blood is a truly singular approach to playing World Leaders, and we need to get a good idea of what this rule set is capable of before we start planning lists and strategies. In general, the Cult of Blood follows a trend that we've already seen in previous codexes, particularly the Chaos Aligned books, presenting an opportunity to run an army composed primarily of mortal thralls instead of superhuman warriors. Though previous editions of Warhammer have shied away from enabling army archetypes like this, 10th edition has bucked that trend, and we've already had quite a number of similar detachments such as Chaos Cult, Iconoclast Fiefdom, Crude Hunting Pack, and more. These detachments have usually been written off by reviewers and other content creators as being too niche, narrative, or generally bad, but at this stage we've actually got plenty of evidence to say that this is an incorrect assumption for these archetypes. The most notable example of this is Chaos Cult, initially widely considered to be an exceptionally bad detachment, with only us here on the Red Path and a few others pointing out that it was actually very competitive. Lo and behold, it proved to be a serious menace on the tabletop with several event wins. Horde detachments can be very powerful skew armies, though they present a fairly unique set of challenges when it comes to playing them. Time management, precise movement, and exploiting synergies number among the most important skills required to pilot these detachments, not to mention a strong spinal cord and a pre-game yoga routine. So does Cult of Blood follow that trend for mortal-based armies, or is it bringing something unique to the table? Well, personally, I actually do think that the Cult of Blood has a pretty unique place among the Horde detachments, primarily due to the detachment rule. So let's take a look at what that does. Everyone, if you've been enjoying the Red Path and want to support the channel, then check out our Patreon. Whether you're into competitive play or just love hobbying your berserkers, there's something in there for you. By signing up to either the Berserker Hobby or Berserker Competitive tier, you'll get access to one of two private channels in the Discord, which focuses on painting and modeling or competitive play. You'll be able to talk shop, jam list ideas, paint jobs, and all that good stuff in there. And if you just can't decide between the two, then grab the 8-bound tier, which gives you access to both. The links are in the description below. Cheers for watching, folks, and keep walking the Red Path. Idols of Khorne is the detachment ability, and it brings something very interesting to the table. Functionally, it isn't dissimilar to, say, Penitent's Host for Sisters of Battle, presenting you with 3 abilities of which you activate 1 in your command phase. Each of these abilities can only be activated once per game, with some slight exceptions we'll get into later. These abilities apply to the army as auras, radiating out from World Leader monster or Titanic vehicle units. If they're emanating from a monster unit, it's a 6-inch range, or 9 inches if it's a Titanic vehicle. The abilities only affect Jackals and Goremonger units, both of which become battle line in this detachment. That's quite a lot of rules, to be honest. So before we even analyze the abilities themselves, let's take a look at which units can be classified as idols based on their requirements. The monster category is where we have the most choice, and your idols will include both types of Demon Prince and Angron himself. Straight off the bat, this is very much dictating how your list will be shaped, and some variation of these units are going to be in every single one of your lists. The Titanic vehicle category unfortunately only has one option, the Lord of Skulls. Now, it is worth mentioning that Sir Killalot has seen a massive glow up in the codex with a dramatically improved datasheet. Given his damage output, the class can actually fill a very important gap that Cult of Blood otherwise lacks: kill power into high toughness units. That said, At his current cost of 505 points, he is taking up a significant portion of your list. Crucially, this does prevent him from going into strategic reserve, which is probably why he's costed so high, but the choice to include him in a Cult of Blood list will dictate the shape of the army a lot more than if you choose to go with monster units instead. Of course, it is worth mentioning that if you play with legend units, Cult of Blood suddenly becomes much funnier, as there are a wide selection of Titanic vehicles on offer. Ever wanted to have a Jackal Horde worshipping a Thunderhawk gunship? Well, I know I have. But enough of that. Let's look at the icon abilities. First off is the Idol of Infinite Rage, which gives +1 to hit and wound for Jackal and Goremonger units when they're within 6 of an idol, or 9 if it's the class. This is unquestionably quite a powerful aura ability. One of the things that people are currently sleeping on is Jackal output in the new codex. With an extra attack each, the basic Jackal becomes quite a threat to marine level infantry when you have sustained and dev wounds up as blessings. You no longer have a non-bow interaction with sustained hits on the datasheet, and now it's actually quite likely for them to body 5 marines in combat. Obviously, with +1 to hit and wound, this damage output increases significantly, and it's not unreasonable for a 10-man Jackal squad to be able to threaten and cripple a significant amount of Space Marine bodies, or even drag down a couple of Custodes Wardens. In particular, if they're going into enemy hordes, they should, in theory, rip through a significant chunk of them. Since the detachment really wants you to build these big 20-man bricks of Jackals, that's quite a lot of output on such a large unit. It's a bit less effective on Goremongers, since the +1 to wound is sort of anti-synergy with their inbuilt lance, but as you'll probably see, by the time the icon activates, most of your Goremongers are going to be dead. On that note, timing your activations for the icons is crucial to get correct. This ability should only go up once you're expecting to have your big push turn, so don't activate it too early in the game. Next up, we have the Idol of Burning Wrath. This grants Jackal or Goremonger units within 6 or 9 of an icon unit +1 to move, charge, and advance. It's less powerful than Infinite Rage, but it's still a useful ability, which you'll most likely be activating early in the game to get your Jackal bricks into staging positions and ensuring your Goremongers lock in the early charges. Ideally, you want to get maximal benefit out of this, so try to have it up when you'll be benefiting from more than just one aspect of the aura. Broadly speaking, the detachment isn't very fast in general, so to avoid spending 2 turns getting into position, you can put this icon up early and get your jacks into position in the midboard quite quickly. Given a 7-inch base move, an average roll on the advance, you're going to typically be looking at a 12 to 13-inch move with your Jackals, and even faster for Goremongers. Finally, we have the Idol of Blessed Blood, which is easily the most powerful ability of all 3. This grants your Jackal and Goremonger units a 4+ invulnerable save when in range of their respective idols. Functionally, this recreates the index version of the footprints, and I think that at this point, the Legend of Josie has proven that 20-man Jackal bricks with a 4+ invul are quite obnoxious to deal with. It's not the only durability boost in the detachment, and I found it a little bit amusing that after many rounds of nerfs in the index, Cult of Blood once more has access to a 4-up, 5-up Jackal brick, and I'm just happy to see that return to the table. Horde detachments typically live and die based on ways of skewing durability, and this idol ability is the crux around which the army pivots. Sure, you can massively boost your damage output with Infinite Rage, but what you really need is your massive Jackal bricks to be sticky. Clogging up the board with hard to shift units is why Horde is so good at scoring and bullying other armies. For that reason, Blessed Blood is the most important idol to activate correctly in this detachment. This is going to be where player skill comes into the equation, as there isn't really a single correct time to use the ability, but rather you'll need to read the board and anticipate future turns, predicting when you expect to receive the most amount of damage and responding accordingly. Naturally, this does combo beautifully with the Demon Prince's Lone Up ability, as it functionally makes him invincible to all but the most sustained firepower when he's surrounded by a Jackal Horde with a 4-up invuln. So overall, how does the detachment ability stack up? Well, if you watch my Slaughterbound video, I spoke a little bit about how detachments that revolve around a particular subset of units and grant an ability which only affects that subset of units need to have rules which dramatically increase the value of those units, but to reinforce your desire to select them in list building and make the entire detachment function on the table. With that in mind, Cult of Blood is very transparent in what it wants you to do. It's telling you to bring big monsters and surround them with mortal thralls. But does it offer enough to make that worthwhile? Personally, I think it does. The 3 idle abilities are very powerful and help overcome the innate weaknesses that the army would otherwise be subjected to. I've often spoken about the holy trinity of combat armies, being durability, damage, and movement. These aspects are key for determining the viability of a combat army, and usually you want to be able to comfortably tick 2 of these 3 boxes. Cult of Blood allows you to toggle between the 3 aspects with a certain degree of flexibility, which is very powerful. It also pushes a fairly unique angle for horde armies in that it encourages you to bring big monsters as the locus of your abilities. While the auras are powerful, the monsters themselves also fill an important gap in the detachment, the ability to punch into durable units. This is particularly apparent with the Lord of Skulls, which can bring answers to the toughest opposition in the game. That said, the idle ability being locked to once per game is a necessary weakness, which can lead to failure if you activate your idols at the wrong time. A Cult of Blood player needs to not only be able to assess the current board state, but also predict future turns, in order to maximize their idle usage, something which isn't particularly easy to do when you're trying to micromanage 200 cultist bodies. In my opinion, this limitation is actually quite well designed, as without it, the detachment would be quite obnoxious and frankly not very enjoyable to play as or against. Overall, it does a good job of presenting a compelling reason to bring loads of jackals and gives a home for the Colossus, amongst others. The detachment rule is certainly good enough to make the army comp viable, but is it backed up by decent enhancements? Let's pivot to those next. There's 4 potent enhancements available to the Cult of Blood. All of them are strong considerations for most lists, though the 3 that you select will inevitably actually be dictated by your HQ selection. First on this list is Chosen of the Blood God. This enhancement is monster locked and it increases the range of the model's auras by 3 inches. So functionally this is going on either variant of the Demon Prince, and being realistic, it's actually only ever going on the Footprints since the Wing variant has no auras other than the idle ones. Naturally, extending the idle aura is a very good boost for the detachment, but also being able to extend the Footprints' CP reduction aura is a strong bonus on the side. On the key turns, with the 4-up Invuln Idol activated, this enhancement allows you to cover a wide area of jackals, so I'd say it's pretty much an auto take in any list with the Footprints. Next up is Butcher Lord, which actually takes us in a completely different direction. The enhancement goes on an infantry model and allows them to join Goremongers or jackals. If they join Goremongers, they also inherit Infiltrate. I really love this enhancement, and it's actually a little bit more interesting than you'd initially think. Unfortunately, due to our lack of generic infantry characters, there is only 2 homes for this, the Master of Executions or a Slaughterbound. This does narrow down the amount of variables we have to consider in the equation, as you've essentially got 4 different squad orientations between 2 HQs and 2 units they can join. That said, there is a little bit to think about here. The main consideration is what to do with either of these HQs and what they bring to the units that they join. The Slaughterbound doesn't do much for them. Resurrecting 1 Jackal or Goremonger isn't really a compelling proposition. However, he does have substantial killing power. Mo, on the other hand, is a little bit less killy, but gives the opportunity to reroll advances and has CP generation built in when he kills enemy characters. You also have to keep in mind that Mo can join 10 Jackals and then have them hop into a Rhino, whereas the Slaughterbound can't do this unless you're bringing a Land Raider. The detachment overall is quite CP intensive, so personally I do like Mo in this slot. And looking at the units they can join, Goremongers is interesting as it allows a potential early rush with a decent combat character, but the Jackals allow a bit more of a slower, staged option. In my opinion, choosing Mo lends itself to joining Jackals, whereas choosing a Slaughterbound lends itself to joining Goremongers. Both are interesting choices, so really it's up to you whichever you decide on. Following on from that, we have Brazen Form. This goes on a monster and gives them +1 toughness and a 5-up Feel No Pain. That's a really solid durability boost for either Prince variant, and if the points are right, you want it in most of your lists. Keeping your icon units alive for longer is a no-brainer, so look to add this in whenever you can. D11 on the footprints pushes a lot of damage breakpoints, and a 5-up Feel No Pain makes them very obnoxious to kill. In a detachment where durability is the focus, it's just a great enhancement. And finally, we have Strategic Slaughter. This enhancement allows you to redeploy 3 Jackal or Goremonger units after both sides have finished deploying. It's a decent enhancement, though it is used before the first turn is determined, so it's primarily going to be used for a little bit of bait and switch tactics or to correct deployment mistakes. I don't mind it as an ability, and redeployment is always quite strong, but it doesn't jump out at me as much as the other ones do. So to summarize, it is overall a strong suite of enhancements which are all worth considering. Different builds will call for different ones, so I think outside of Chosen, there isn't really any auto-take enhancements, but nor are there any dump ones. They generally do a good job of supporting the detachment, but the real pivot point is the stratagems, so let's turn to those next. Cult of Blood has some brilliant stratagems to choose from, most of which interact either with Jackals and Goremongers or their idle units. While the detachment isn't quite as CP intensive as Slaughterband, for example, it will still burn through them at a rapid rate, so look to your Demon Princes for discounts, or a Butcher Lord Mo for regaining cost. There's a couple of 2 CP strats in here, which will be used in quite literally every Cult of Blood game, so managing your economy is still a vital skill for making this detachment shine. Let's start breaking them down. Kicking things off, we have Bloody Vengeance, and for 1 CP it allows a Jackal or Goremonger unit to get full rerolls against an enemy that has just killed one of your idle units for the rest of the game. It's a solid offensive boost for the gang, but it does caveat on you losing a keystone unit in your list. There is an argument to try and bait this out with something like an early rush Wing Prince, but you do have to balance that carefully with the cost of losing an idle. It does work nicely with overcoming some of the more challenging matchups such as Knights, where getting full hit rerolls on a big Knight will certainly help push through a solid volume of lethal hits. Being a reactionary strat, it's pretty decent overall and at least allows for some counterplay if you lose a Prince. Bonus points if you pull this off multiple times using a revived Angron, of course. Drawn to the Slaughter is up next, and for 2 CP it allows you to revive a Jackal unit that has just been destroyed, immediately placing them in reserves. Since it's a resurrection strat, you're only going to be able to use this once per game, but you will use it in every single game. It's basically saying that for 2 CP, you start every game with a bonus 20 Jackals, and that's a no-brainer for me. I'm not 100% sure if the footprints can make this 1 CP, as you technically target a destroyed unit, so you're not within range of his aura, so to speak, so if anyone can clarify that in the comments, I think it would be quite helpful. Moving on though, we have In the Shadow of Brass Idols. For 1 CP, this is used when your opponent targets a Jackal or Goremonger unit in shooting or fighting. It gives them a 6-up Feel No Pain, or a 5-up if they're in range of an idol. Index players will fondly remember the durability of 5-up Feel No Pain Jackals, so you can recreate the magic here. It pairs beautifully with the 4-up invuln from the idol, and if that idol is a footprints, you can make this strat free. Honestly, it's not that complicated to explain, and anything which is keeping your Jackals on the board for longer is a great ability. Speaking from experience, I've seen entire gun lines empty into a 20-man Jackal brick with these buffs, and still had a couple survive. If you really need to soak up some firepower or lock down an area of the board, this is the strat for you. Once you push out into the open, you're going to be using this in every single turn. Bloodthirsty Horde is next on the agenda, which for 1 CP gives Jackals and Goremongers at 3-inch engagement range. It's pretty much pointless in Goremongers, but it is a big help on those 20-man bricks of Jackals who desperately want to ensure that they drown you in dice. Obviously, this goes really well with the 6-inch pile-in Con Blessing, allowing you to tag and punch a greater range of units, but overall it's just really solid for making sure you can maximize your damage output. Next we have Fail Not the Blood God. For 1 CP, this lets your Jackal and Goremonger units reroll hits of 1 or full rerolls if they're in icon range. Given that you're going to be doing a lot of fishing for 6s, it's just an amazing strat to push through more sustained or lethal hits. Again, it's another way of spiking damage into units which Jackals have no business threatening. A 20-man brick makes great use out of this stratagem, and it's going to be even more useful on your early game skirmishers who need to confirm kills on annoying 5-man units. Finally, we have Brazen Idol, and this is definitely the strongest stratagem in the detachment. For 2 CP, you target an idle unit, replacing your current idle aura with a different one of your choosing. You can only use the stratagem once per game, but it is exceptional. It will mostly be used to reactivate the 4-up invuln, but you should also consider the +1 to hit wounds combo if you're going into tough targets. While it does replace your current idle on that unit, it doesn't prevent overlapping buffs from different idle units, meaning you can have situations where your offensive and defensive abilities are up at the same time. You need to plan this stratagem use very carefully, since you only have one go of it, and since it's done in your command phase, you have to anticipate exactly how the turn ahead is going to go. There's another really interesting way to use this stratagem, and I'm going to talk about that in the unit combos in just a little bit. To summarize though, Cult of Blood has a lot of excellent stratagems, and none of them are duds, in my opinion. Brazen Idol and Drawn to Slaughter will be used in every single game, and there's decent combat buffs available too, as well as keystone durability enhancers. Overall, they mesh really well with the detachment ability, so it's a big thumbs up from me. Next up, we're going to put everything together and examine some key combos which make the most of this rule set. So we've broken down all the rules that Cult of Blood can access, but how does it all mesh together? And what combos or tactics can exploit these abilities? Well, there's some nuance here, and I think it does depend on how you're structuring your list to a certain extent. But there are keystone units and interactions which pretty much every Cult of Blood player should be aware of. Let's spend a little bit of time breaking those down. First, we have to talk about Jackals, because really they're the cornerstone unit in this detachment. On paper, without considering any buffs, these guys aren't all that impressive, but in reality, there's always going to be a multitude of factors affecting them which enhance both their durability and output at any given time. 24 Strength 3 AP 0 attacks doesn't sound like much, but when you start to roll in sustained, lethal hits, dev wounds versus infantry, all of a sudden they're starting to become a little bit freaky on the table. Cult of Blood wants you to lean into these layered buffs and presents a few extra ones in the form of +1 to hit and wounds, reroll hits, and defensive boosts to boot. When you consider the brass lasagna of abilities which can, and often will, be affecting these mortals, their damage output goes into a very interesting area. There's of course some other ways of augmenting that output, notably amongst these is nearby 8-bounds, who are a strong contender for inclusion in any Cult of Blood list. Obviously their ability doesn't stack with the idle ability if it's active, but having them almost as a mini idle is kind of interesting. And the 8-bound buff for +1 to wound versus below half strength enemies will actually come up a lot more in cults than in other detachments, so don't forget about that one either. We also have to mention the considerable durability buffs available to Jackals. Access to Feel No Pain and Invuln saves greatly enhances the detachment's ability to flood the board with annoying units that will live through far more than they should. In my opinion, this is actually the part that you want to think about a lot more, since having these massive tar pit units is far better for scoring than ones which can spike damage. With that in mind, I'd like you to consider the humble Predator Destructor for a moment. Think about a situation where you've just put up your 4-up invuln idle buff, and you have the capacity to throw up a 5-up Feel No Pain on a big squad too. You need your Jackals to push through an enemy counter attack which is lined up, so how can you reduce that damage output even further? Roll in the Predator Destructor. This guy has broadly been outshone by the Forge Fiend, understandably so, but in Cult there is a unique case for the good old autocannon tank. What you want to do with Predator is unload its main turret and sponsons into a single target, probably doing a decent amount of damage to them and whittling down their output. You then want to fire your combi bolter into a unit which is also threatening your Jackal brick, and activate the -1 to hit on that unit. In this way, you cripple one unit and degrade the other's hit rolls, significantly reducing the overall output. When that pairs with the Jackal invulns and Feel No Pain, they'll genuinely have a very challenging time picking up that squad. So for that reason, I actually think 2 Predators is a really strong inclusion in Cult of Blood lists. And speaking of tanks, there's another couple worth mentioning. The Rhino and Land Raider bring something interesting to the table in the form of armoured transportation. Now, I imagine there's a lot of people that have never put Jackals inside a Rhino, let alone a Land Raider, but it is worth considering. one of Cult's key weaknesses is being a little bit slower at getting to its staging positions, but this can be overcome by the use of transports. I find the Rhino particularly interesting here, since the reactive disembark allows you to get real janky with jackals in a variety of situations, such as jumping them out in idle range, mobbing a point with OC, or creating annoying screens. If you're running a Master of Executions with Butcher Lord, it's a great place for him to go too. If you end up going with Mass Transport Jackal Rush, you'll also shield yourself somewhat from indirect fire. I wouldn't say it's a meta combo necessarily, but it's something that you should think about when you're building your cult lists. And to finish talking about jackals, I do want to draw attention to an interesting use of the Brazen Idol Stratagem. So as we know, this stratagem allows an idle unit to swap out their current aura and allows you to reselect one you've already activated. However, I think there's another use for this ability than what you would initially imagine. Say you've gotten through the first turn or two without anything much occurring, and you're nicely staged for a big push turn. You've got a choice to make though. Are you going to go with damage output and put up +1 to hit and wounds, or go defensive and get your invulns? The damage output has obvious appeal, but you have to remember that you'll then be subjected to a counter attack and your units will be vulnerable. The play here, I think, is to activate the army-wide 4-up invuln and then spend Brazen Idol to throw up +1 to hit and wound on, for example, a winged or footprints that's going to be part of the main attack. In this way, you can hit the enemy with a strong punch, but still have your shields up for the following turn. The only part here which I'm unsure about is if using the buff via Brazen Idol technically burns its use for the rest of the game. I'm not fully sure how this interaction works, but you can imagine that it would be very powerful if you could then rebuff the survivors with damage output a second time. It does mean that you won't technically get a 4th buff throughout the game if you use it this way, but it does ensure that you have a full turn of substantial damage and durability at the same time. Continuing with the running theme of Cult making suboptimal units shine, I am going to mention Angron before we move on. Yes, I know he's gone through a tough time, but you can't ignore his potential in Cult. He counts for an idle unit, and with such a large base, he can extend the aura significantly more than a Demon Prince. He brings a source of high damage to the army, which is an area it can struggle with, and more so than other detachments, his auras can actually be meaningful. I've already talked about enhancing durability quite a bit, so if you consider the possibility of Angron locking up multiple Jackal Tarpit units in combat with the no fallback aura, you could put yourself in a crazy strong position. Cult suddenly becomes a lot more scary when you've got 60 Jackal bodies with a 4-up invuln that you can't be shot. Given his current points, he is an attractive proposition if you're trying to decide between him and the Lord of Skulls, so don't write him off. So without getting too deep into niche interactions, I'm going to move our attention to detachment archetypes next and work through what I think are the two most common and competitive ways to build cult lists. One of the hardest parts of writing this detachment focus was working out army archetypes. When I started drafting lists, it very quickly became apparent that it's hard to squeeze everything you want into a cult list. Compromise isn't something that this detachment enjoys, and as points currently stand, it is challenging to get a list that you want with everything in it. With that said, I think I've found two archetypes which broadly cover what most cult players, all 8 of them globally, will want to build towards. So let's jump into them. First up is an archetype that I call Carrion Horde. There's no messing around with this archetype, and it simply tries to put as many bodies on the board as possible, while still having decent support pieces and can make things work. In Carrion Horde, you're going to want to build a minimum of 60 Jackals, but ideally go for 80 to 90. Since you're planning a meat wall, you'll want to buy yourself a lot of time to get into position, so you're also going to need a minimum 2 Goremonger units to screen and jail your opponent's advance for as long as possible. After that, we need to think about our idols. Unfortunately, Carrion Horde can't really make use of the Lord of Skulls or Angron as big idols. They simply absorb too many points, and the auras are then localized around 1 or 2 models, instead of spreading them across the horde of bodies. For that reason, you're going to want about 3 princes, ideally 2 on foot at a minimum. When you're managing buffs across 80-ish bodies, you need to make sure you can spread out and cover everything. With that done, you've then got a core of idols and mortals, which is probably going to absorb nearly 3/4 of your list points, giving you a little bit of space for support pieces. Now, your support needs to build in one of two directions, either enhancing Jackal survivability or damage output, and this makes the choice pretty easy. It kind of links back to those key unit combos we already talked about. Here you're going to be looking at your 8 bounds or your predators. Depending on your playstyle, you'll want that bigger punch or staying power, so let your own style inform that choice. Personally, I really value the predators. You should have a few skirmish points left over after this, so fill those out as you want to. And you'll end up with an archetype which is predominantly mortal bodies with a lot of support pieces around them. It's an archetype which doesn't necessarily want to blend your opponent, but instead flood the board and be really annoying to shift. Of course, you can and should have a big push turn, but damage output isn't really the goal. Instead, it's about pressure and constriction. Make it impossible for your opponent to sit on points simply by virtue of being everywhere. And don't forget, even if you only bring 60 Jackals to the table, you've actually got 80 thanks to the strat to revive a squad. Of the two archetypes I'm talking about, this is much more skewed and will absolutely have some rough matchups. Personally though, I kind of find it very interesting and I sort of want to try it out. The second archetype though is one that I call Bloodwave, and it moves in a bit of a different direction. It shaves down the amount of mortal bodies in favour of bringing out the big boys. So to begin with, you're faced with a choice between Angron and the Lord of Skulls, and hopefully you're going to get 2 princes in to support that as well. Realistically, because of the high cost of those idols, you're going to top out at around 60 Jackals, so your horde presence is reduced compared to Carrion Horde, but you gain flexibility in the form of damage output. Because you care less about augmenting your Jackals, you can build in some solid support datasheets as well. Here, Forge Fiends, 8 bound, even 10 Zerkers with Khorne are all good choices. The archetype plays quite differently to Carrion Horde and actually ends up being a wave-based approach to the game. Your first wave will usually be a Goremonger jail screen to tie the opponent up. Then you're actually probably going to send in all your 60 odd Jackals to tarp it and weaken the enemy lines. Finally, when they're crippled and starting to trail victory points, your hard hitters enter the picture. It's maybe a little bit less thematic than Carrion Horde, but it's a much more balanced archetype which doesn't skew so hard into Horde. It also gives you a chance to run the Lord of Skulls out in a very cool and unique way. Bloodwave is definitely a healthier play experience, but it doesn't abuse the detachment quite as much as Carrion Horde, and whichever way you decide to go, I've got example lists next for both of those archetypes, so let's look at them. Okay, we'll start with Carrion Horde, and honestly, I'm a pretty big fan of this list. The list begins with 3 Demon Princes, 2 on foot and 1 with wings. Strategic Slaughter goes on the Wing Prince for a cheeky redeploy, and Chosen of the Blood God goes on a Foot Prince for a bigger aura. We also have a Master of Executions with Butcher Lord. Moving on to the literal meat of the list, we have 2 squads of Goremongers and 6 squads of Jackals. 3 of these are 10 mans and 3 are 20, giving us a total of 90 Jackals. Rounding things off, we have the 2 Predator Destructors and, because I felt spicy, a Land Raider. Now this might seem a little bit crazy, but it does go back to those unit combos I talked about earlier with transportation options. So the 10-man squad with Mo attached is going to be hanging out in the Raider as a cheeky little scalpel to regain you some command points, while the Raider itself brings not inconsiderable firepower to the table to help overcome the list's weakness to heavy armor and support the Predator firepower too. Overall, it's a simple list, in my opinion, and it plays that type of game Carrion Horde wants, where you just flood the board and live through more damage than you should. Pivoting to a list for Bloodwave though, we're going to start with 2 Foot Princes, one with Chosen of the Blood God. And dropping that 3rd Prince and Mo, we're instead going to have a Lord of Skulls as our 3rd idol unit. In the chaff department, we shave down on those Jackals, ending up with 3 20-man squads and a single 10-man, while we do retain our 2 Goremonger units, which are vital. Our support is a bit more bulked out. We've got 2 8-bound units to help off those Jackals, and a single Hellbrood for weird Beyblade madness. It brings the list to 1995, and in my opinion is probably a better all-rounder compared to the first one. While it doesn't quite bring so many bodies to the table, you're still going to rock about 70 to 90 Jackals, and you've got a solid capacity for shooting and hammering high toughness targets with the Lord of Skulls. It's probably more fun to play and play against this version, I won't lie, but I am feeling myself drawn to the Carrion Horde archetype, so it'll probably be the first one I try out. So to summarize the detachment focus, Cult of Blood is a freaky but fun way of playing World Eaters. I think GW did a good job differentiating this detachment from other horde based ones, and it's nice to see them incentivizing using centerpiece models like the Lord of Skulls. Overall, I think it's a very polarizing detachment, and people are either going to love or hate it, and I understand that. Competitively, no matter which way you build it, it is going to be a skew army, which can flatten some opposition and fold to others. What's interesting to consider is potential point drops in upcoming balance slates. This detachment could become absolutely brutal if it gained 100 to 200 points, but we'll have to wait and see how that one shakes out. So to close things out, thanks so much folks for sticking with me through this video. Personally, I kind of love Cult of Blood, and I hope that maybe you might be drawn to the worship of giant brass beacons now as well. As always though, I would love to hear your thoughts, so make sure you comment down below, like the video, and subscribe if you haven't. For now though, I've been Dara, you've been watching The Red Path, and until the next one, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.